Hello, folks. Today we're here to talk about structural transformation, institutions, and growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, this is a sequel to our previous session on broad issues regarding the topics of structural transformation, institutions, and growth in developing countries. And the as I pointed out in the syllabus, uh, I'm using as reference this report issued by the World Bank last year, and as I sent you by email, additionally, not necessarily as mandatory readings, but a copy of my most recent book, uh, particularly in this case because there are two chapters there dealing directly with the technological transformations, which are part of the argumentation taken into account here. Okay, so uh, before going, let me just remind ourselves of what we discussed about structural transformation. As as we mentioned, structural transformation accompanies the economic growth. It appeared clearly in the case of leaving the poverty trap. Inevitably, this means that was associated with people shifting from subsistence activities, uh, typically in agriculture, towards other activities embedded with a higher degrees of technology usually standardized and brought in uh, through equipments in the case of manufacturing and so on. So since the outset, the structural transformation out of subsistence activities was at the center of our narrative. Uh, Also, as some of you asked and inquired about, what would be the role, the central or not, of manufacturing and vis-a-vis service? Uh, and we will deal exactly with that, with a look particularly to the region, to Latin America and the Caribbean. So uh, the first takeaway is when a sustained period of rising income and living standards happens, it coincides with changes in the distribution of economic activity across three broad sectors of an economy: agriculture, industry, and service. But these are very much broad aggregates because there's a lot of heterogeneity inside in one of those three, as we will see. We have two sides in this coin. You have the production and the side of final use, roughly supply and demand sides. And economic activity at the sector level is generally measured through employment shares, the structure of employment in the economy, value added shares, which do not necessarily coincide. There are several reasons why they do not necessarily coincide, the value added and the employment shares. But also there is the view from the standpoint of the final consumption expenditures, the final use of goods. And of course, foreign trade makes possible that on the one side, the employment and value added shares, which refer to production side measures, not necessarily equal the side of the demand, since the final consumption expenditure shares refer to the consumption side. Two caveats. First, do not expect, obviously, the same equal pattern across countries, but they would tend to share similar trends on the demand side, particularly. There is a reasonable homogeneity of preference across countries, and we will refer to them as the income grows and the patterns of consumption also evolve. But there will be country-specific difference. For instance, in the case of natural resource-rich countries, it's likely that the share on the production side of natural resource-rich activities, natural resource-intensive activities, exhibit a higher share of both employment and value added relative to the other countries. And one important observation, the extractive industries, which are very close to the natural resource base, they are included in the statistics as such as industries. Okay, but let's look at the what can one say about the patterns of structural transformation. Look, this shows the position of these countries and of the rest of the world in the case of agriculture. Okay, so you have some examples here from the region, the countries covered in the report: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela. And the rest of the world here, the gray dots, can be, let's say, taken as exactly expressing the evolution of the GDP per capita and the value and the share of value added in agriculture, as well as the share of employment in agriculture. And see, there is a first remark to make here with respect to the evolution. That is to say, first, at lower income levels, agriculture accounts for a dominant share of resource and output. No surprise here. And second, as well, no surprise, as an economy grows, the agriculture sector shrinks in terms of both employment and value added share. This is quite clear in the chart. But then we go to industry and service. Let me plot them simultaneously to the extent of possible. And notes the following. There is also a pattern here in the sense that, you know, if you look at the two charts, both industry and service increase in prominence. You can see in both charts. That is to say, initially, both the industrial and service sectors expand. However, unlike service, which continue to grow at higher levels of income, the industrial sector eventually reaches a peak, and that's quite important, and then begins contracting. This appears clearly in this chart, and this peak, this pattern, is commonly known as the hump shape of industry. It tends to evolve according to this hump shape. What would be the fundamental mechanisms underlying such a structural transformation that is depicted in the three charts? Two, let me highlight two. One, on the demand side, on the composition of final use of goods. The income elasticity of demand varies across sectoral goods. Income elasticity of demand is the percentage increase in the demand for something as income grows. So inevitably the industrial goods have a high income elasticity of demand as the income goes up to middle and upper levels. But after a certain point, the income elasticity of demand for industrial goods decrease relative, for instance, to the income elasticity of demand for service. As I referred to, you don't pile up cars at your garage as your income grows after a certain point, and you start to consume more service, tourism, sophisticated personal service. There is clearly a pattern of evolution of demand that is reasonably general, broad. You will find such a tendency in the US, in Brazil, in India, in China, everywhere. And the second fundamental mechanism underlying the structural transformation that I depicted in the two charts is the fact that the technological growth, the exogenous, the technological growth in each, it differs across sectors, which generates long-term changes in the relative price of sectoral goods. The higher growth in productivity of the industrial sector would not only lead to lower relative price, but also it would tend to push workers out of the sector towards the service sector. And that's why there is something you will see in the report, and it's easy to find reference to that, that the share of employment in the industrial sector tends to decrease faster than even the value-added share. Because of the higher productivity, lower jobs are necessary, while at the same time, even if at the end of the day, the value-added share of the industry tend to decline after a hump, it will still, let's say, be more pronounced than it is the case of employment. And this second mechanism is called the price effect. And so the two fundamental mechanisms, the income effect and the price effect, lead to the hump curve. That is to say, industrialization as a share both of value added and of employment, reaching peaks. And this has, you saw that in the exactly, you see this in the chart as income, the industrial sector peaks. You see this in the rest of the world, right? This is clearly the case of employment. Now, then moving on specifically to say something on Latin America and the Caribbean. And then we have something quite important. Look, these lines here, these are the regressions and so on, the curves fitted by the analysts that wrote the report. Let's say fitting the data of the whole set of groups correspondingly. This is for all the countries, and interesting. See, this is the employment share in manufacturing. Look at the hump curve here. Here you have the hump curve, even if it has not gone down the hill. But you also have the data fitted for LAC, for Latin America and the Caribbean, and you also have, oh, this is the in red is the fitness for high income countries. Yeah, the blue is everybody, the average, but look at the hump in the case of the advanced economies. You'll probably have noted something quite important there, which is Latin America reaching the peak, apparently, before the levels of the advanced economies. And this is what has been named by a great economist, Danny Roderick, that is referred to in the report, as a premature deindustrialization experienced in many Latin America, many developing economies. Is to say, as Danny Roderick stated, many developing economies are entering the deindustrialization phase at lower levels of income per capita, and they are achieving lower peaks of industrial shares relative to the developed countries. And as the chart shows clearly, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are at the forefront of this process. And the report documents in detail for this sample of Latin American and Caribbean economies, uh, for which comparable data exist. And they confirm the finding of Budrick in the sense that the process known as deindustrialization has in fact begun at lower levels of GDP per capita relative to the experience of advanced nations. And the share of manufacturing total value added has peaked at lower levels than for advanced economies. Well, this is concerning because in most countries, the industrial sector has the highest level of labor productivity and the highest rate of productivity growth. And when, and this premature deindustrialization taking place means that labor is moving away from the industrial sector into most often lower productivity growth sectors, some of the service, which tends to reduce the overall productivity with negative consequence for real income growth and the standard of living. And indeed, in the LAC region, the structural transformation has contributed negatively to productivity growth. The magnitude of that is quite important, and we will refer to it very soon. But the point to make here is that the relative share of employment in service, including the sectors with the lowest rate of productivity growth, has significantly increased. And therefore, this premature deindustrialization is worrisome. Okay, let me say something about how special is the manufacturing industry. Look, what makes it tendentially unique vis-a-vis the other two is the fact that many of the manufacturing activities are subject to geographical mobility. In some cases, the simplest case, the case particularly where the need for skills and labor is not high, the transfer of equipment and processes is enough. And which makes possible that the technological learning that we discussed about and the approximation to the global frontier of productivity is in principle easier than in other sectors, as it is the case in agriculture and most service. And it's also, therefore, special in the dissemination of technologies in the economic system, particularly, as I said, in the case where the technologies are embedded in equipment and corresponding processes. But it's important to highlight that local horizontal factors specific to a country or region condition that crossing towards the border, and not by chance. The dispersion in the industry's productivity among countries is not less than in other economic segments. But this is important to highlight because, precisely because of its mobility, the manufacturing industry is particularly sensitive to change in horizontal factors. And we will stress the relevance of those horizontal factors in the Latin American case. But let me mention something. One interesting conclusion of the outlined in the first chapter of the report is the evidence that trade has not been a major factor in explaining the observed patterns of the changing economic structure of the LAC region. Trade is important in many specific cases. Take Korea, take the smaller countries. But the data used in the manipulating the report points to the comparative advantage hypothesis in explaining the structural change patterns in the region as not that much significant. This follows from the fact that Latin America and the Caribbean is, in relative terms, commercially closed, even if some Latin American countries as we discussed in the session on the reforms in the 80s and 90s, implemented trade opening strategies, overall, the region is still, in relative terms, commercially closed. So the foreign trade, Chinese, Korean products cannot be blamed as responsible for the structural transformation. On the other hand, the role of intermediate inputs and the input-output relationships between sectors clearly have had quantitative importance in explaining the observed economic structure in LAC and in other developing countries. And as the report shows, distortions in intermediate markets may play a quantitatively important role in explaining the size of the industrial sector. And distortions in the sourcing of intermediate service inputs may have a particularly important role. So the premature deindustrialization may have a lot to do. It clearly has a lot to do, not with the features of the manufacturing industry itself, but with service that serve as inputs at the production of the manufacturing industry. Just to give an idea, let me highlight this result of the report. They make a simulation to show that, let's say, if the service input distortions had been maintained at the minimum levels that they showed that they had in the period from 95 to 2011, this would imply an industrial sector 2 to 0.5 percentage points larger, which is a considerable effect, taking into account the actual industrial share of about 20 percentage points in these countries. Let me also highlight three features of the premature deindustrialization in Latin America. Like elsewhere, like in the United States, the deindustrialization process is reflected more acutely in terms of the share of employment rather than the share of value added, for the reasons that I explained. The introduction of labor-saving technologies that increase productivity and help sustain the share of value added, but do not foster job creation. Second feature, there is obviously substantial heterogeneity in where they stand, in where the countries in the region stand in the industrialization process. Two countries with a higher per capita income, Argentina and Chile, have gone through a deindustrialization process accentuated now for decades. Whereas Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, they display stagnant or slight increase in the share of the industrial employment, and among other reasons, because they are at lower levels of per capita income. And on the other extreme, the least developed economies, in the case of the sample approach in the report, is Bolivia, is still industrializing. This, in any case, it doesn't mean that the performance in the region, even in the case of let's say the relatively poorer countries, is not happening. The precocious peak of industrialization is a matter prevailing all over the region. And third, just a slight remark, of course, we cannot simply interpret everything based on shares, because, of course, the absolute number of jobs in the industrial sector is still increasing in some countries in the region, or it is steady, even the countries that have been industrializing for decades. But the point is that at the same time, the number of jobs in the service sectors has skyrocketed, leading to a declining share of industrial jobs. Let me then refer to the figures that underline my take about although deindustrialization, the premature deindustrialization is of concern, but empirically, the report shows that it has not the effects have been negative, but relatively small. They refer to effects on the order of 0.1% of output. So the premature deindustrialization process observed in the LAC region since the 80s has not been very costly in terms of output loss. This is not to say that there is no room for improvement or that there is no scope for government policies to improve the allocation of resources across the economy. But the point to make is the focus should be on raising productivity in all sectors and facilitating the transition of workers and resources among sectors. And as we approach in the following, there are productivity issues in all sectors of the economy. Look at this. This is a comparison of productivity levels in the three sectors between the countries in the region and the United States, taken as a frontier, as we've done before. So look at this. The region displays the largest productivity gap relative to the United States in the agricultural sector. Of course, there are regional disparities and crop disparities. I myself have spoken a lot about the frontier stage of soybeans and sugarcane in Brazil as well. But that's not the same to, let's say, the other areas of Brazil being used for agriculture. So you have a discrepancy very accentuated inside countries and inside crop and among the types of crops. In the case of the industrial sector, the gap is, let's say, the smallest of the three, corroborating what I said about the higher higher ease of transferring technology and moving towards the frontier. But even so, the output per worker represents less than 40%, 40% of the productivity in the US industrial sector. But maybe the most worrisome is the gap in the service sectors, because more than 60% of the workforce is employed in service in the region. And the productivity of the service sectors in the LAC region is about 25% that of the United States. Let's give a brief look at the profile of productivity in the sectors. This is the case of agriculture by regions and so on. It breaks down the increase in production into higher use of land or lower use of land, the role of the inputs, which in the case of the sophisticated agriculture in Brazil is fundamental, right? But it also makes an estimation of the TFP at the sector. Remember, the total factor productivity at that increase in productivity that cannot be accounted for by the use of inputs, right? Since the beginning, I've been hammering with it. And indeed, although agricultural productivity has increased in the LAC region, there's still room for further improvement. And two main avenues for that are either improving the technical efficiency of producers using existing technology, and or both, pushing out the production possibilities frontier by shifting to new improved technologies. and the broader concept of agricultural productivity measured by the total factor productivity, right, shows that the TFP growth average in the region has been something around 2.3% a year during the first decade of the 21st century. So this is something notable, but still to go. Let's see then the picture, move to the picture of productivity in the case of the industry and service. Look at this. In the report, you can, you look at the charts and check the evolution of the dynamics for each one of those countries. This is a long-term range because it looks from 1950 to 2010, measured as value added per worker. And the problem is that if you look at the right side, although there is some evidence of convergence in industrial productivity on the left side, the performance of the service sectors in Latin America is worsening relative to that of the United States. Even the best performers that you can see in the chart, which are Chile and Brazil, the chart shows how they managed to outpace the United States in terms of industrial productivity growth, which indicates convergence, different here. However, even for Chile and Brazil, the best performers of the region, the pace of productivity growth in the service sectors could not keep up with the productivity growth in the United States. Really surprising and disappointing has been the performance of Mexico, which is something to be understood better. Maybe this has to do exactly with the stress made by my friend Santiago Levy, the great Mexican economist, on the lack of reforms, of institutional reforms in Mexico. Mexico went through a process of integration and trade opening when it comes to the maquilas in the north, and Mexico is inserted into the global value chains as the case in the region of a high degree of trade integration. But this happened while, let's say, a substantial part of the domestic setting of the Mexican economy remained without structural reforms. That's a point that he makes all the time to explain why Mexico has not, let's say, exhibited higher rates of productivity and growth, even after trade integration with the US. But the most worrisome case in those pictures is Bolivia, whose level of productivity declined over the course of 6 decades. See, and this underperformance of many of Latin America's service sectors is also worrisome in view of the fast pace of deindustrialization in the region. So although there is a scope for slowing down deindustrialization by addressing the distortions that underlie it, as I referred to, the prospects of sustaining growth acceleration in the region becomes, one may say, grimmer because of the lower pace of productivity growth in service. And since the industrialization precipitates the reallocation of economic activity towards those sectors, being slow growing is of concern. Something quite important about the industrial sector, especially specifically in the case of the manufacturing subsector, the evidence depicted in the report shows that there is a substantial degree of misallocation between firms. Remember, I hammered TFP is explainable by the side of technology and the side of efficiency. And in fact, you look at the picture and vis-a-vis the other regions in the sectors, the firm size distribution in the case of the region, is really skewed towards small and micro enterprise. And so this points to distortions in the market that are preventing the consolidation and growth of the most productive firms, uh, leaving, let's say, a composition of firms that, let's say, do not enjoy benefits of scale, of economies of scale. So it follows that the governments need to institute policies that foster competition. And that includes international trade agreements or deepening of existing regional trade agreements. The governments also need to review some of the policies that are very much size dependent, that favor smallness. Smallness in this case is not necessarily beautiful. Small is Beautiful is a famous book of 30 years ago or so. But in the case here, smallness is not beautiful because it leads to inefficiency. But obviously, of course, the future of industrialization in the region is subject to requirements that are increasing for complementary infrastructure, technology absorption capacity, and workforce skills. If you look at the chapters 9 and 10 of my book, uh, firms will need to adopt new technologies just to stay competitive. And the introduction of new labor-saving technologies is reducing the importance of low wages as a determinant of competitive advantage. Instead, see there, you have quality, reduced time to market, faster innovation, and scale economies are becoming more relevant. And emerging technologies such as 3D printing and smart manufacturing, they are expected to shorten the global value chains, limiting the opportunities for entry. Uh, so, urgently needed are a comprehensive set of policy actions to address productivity issues in the service sector. Because since the opportunities for reverse premature industrialization, deindustrialization, or reindustrialization, they tend to be more limited. So we cannot avoid the fact that the service sectors will rise in importance, both as part of the value added and of job creation. And guess what? The service sectors already employ more than 60% of the workforce in the region. And the evidence is that the misallocation of resource is even higher than in manufacturing. And keep the word servicification of manufacturing that is treated in the chapters of my book. That is to say, an increasing component of service as part of the manufacturing value chain. And so more service are being used both as inputs in the production of goods. Those are the embodied service. And more services are provided to customers bundled with the goods, the embedded service, like the service embedded in an iPad or in an iPhone. So the increased productivity of backbone service, logistics, ICT, business service, they could ripple throughout the economy, having larger impacts on overall aggregate productivities. So reduction in the cost of service inputs could have quantitatively important effects on the size of the industrial sector. And in particular, the region can dramatically improve on customs, on infrastructure, the logistic quality components. So just to give an idea, okay, so there is room for improvement in all sectors of the economy. but a dedicated reform agenda is urgently needed for the service sector. Okay. Now let me refer to you when I keep emphasizing. Okay, see the point. Structural transformation matters, and the pattern of deindustrialization, premature deindustrialization, has been bad for productivity growth in the region. Okay, taken that. I said the size may not be that much big, but it is there, it's undeniable. But then I moved on to the productivity in the sectors. And then I said, we have problems. The region has problems with productivity in all three sectors, so different degrees between agriculture, industry, and service, but we have them all. Let me show you something. This is, I did not include this text in our program, but I decided to bring this result of a study that I did with Fernanda Denegri, a colleague, on exactly the contraposition of those two factors, sector structure versus productivity. And let me explain to you what this chart shows. What it shows is the following. The simulations there displayed, they show the effects of what would happen to the Brazilian productivity, overall GDP and productivity, if Brazil had the same occupational structure as the US or Germany, while maintaining, let's say, the current levels of intra-sector productivity. And as the chart shows, what the figures that show is that the following. The Brazilian productivity would be 68.3% higher, which is a lot, if Brazil had the same occupational structure of the US, and 58.2% in the case of Germany. As you know, as this referred to, look at how the occupational structure in China is still, let's say, not at the stage comparable to the US and Germany. Mexico would be 5.6%, okay? No, sorry. Brazil would have 5.6% higher TFP if Brazil had the same occupational structure as Mexico. But now compare this with if Brazil had the sectoral productivity, the same sectoral productivity as China, Mexico, the US, and Germany, keeping the occupational structure that Brazil has had at the moment when those simulations were made. And look at this. The Brazilian aggregate productivity would be 576.9% higher than what it is. And 427.9% if it had the sector productivity of Germany. Look at this. Just compare those with those, and you see how the sectoral productivity, the difference in productivity in the case of each sector, matters quantitatively much more than simply the occupational structure, the structural change. Okay, so let me then make my final considerations on the future of jobs and what are the implications for economic policy that we can take from our discussion here. As for the future of work, three major economic forces are changing the nature of work and the demand for skills. In the case of the region. First, structural transformation and the premature deindustrialization process imply that job creation in the future will be concentrated in the service sector. Second, accompanying the shift in economic infrastructure is a transformation of the occupational structure within broad economic sectors. Service occupations, those that produce intangible value added, are rising in all sectors, implying a huge shift in the demand for skills in the labor market. And third, that has not been emphasized yet. Given that the simpler, more routine tasks will be automated and performed by machines, workers will need to adapt and perform a different set of tasks in the workplace. Just to give an idea, already in the LAC region, there has been a decline in the demand for routine manual tasks, and there has been a rise in the demand for non-routine tasks, which involve both cognitive, analytical skills and interpersonal skills. By cognitive analytical skills, I refer to critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving rather than doing repetitive functions. And as for the interpersonal skills, the ability to do teamwork, negotiation, managing, and so on. So that's the future. There's no ground to fear mass technological unemployment. These things are not happening in such a speed. But many occupations will be affected and transformed by the emerging technologies. And although the overall number of jobs may not fall dramatically, many of the tasks being performed by humans today will likely be performed by machines in the future. Workers will interact with more machines and will be expected to understand increasingly complex technologies. So future jobs and tasks will require different and higher order capabilities and skills. As for economic policy, first, let's say broad statement, promoting productivity growth. Policymakers should not focus on the sectoral size. Let's say, well, what's the size of the industry that I want? And rather on the productivity growth. So requirements in terms of the skills mix and the use of electronic platforms will increase. And these changes tend to be labor saving. The industrial sector could continue contributing positively to aggregate productivity growth and value added, but not as much to job creation, especially for unskilled labor. So, there comes inevitably the idea that policies should look at the value chain, not on the sector. That is to say, it's important to look at how the sectors interact with each other. The servicification of economic activity in general and of manufacturing in particular offers new opportunities for growth. And in fact, as we alluded to, it has been the bad performance in some of these inputs, as service inputs that undermined the longevity or the extension of industrialization in the region. Second point, and obviously, just to complement, logistic infrastructure is also a must because it's necessary to enable efficient and affordable transportation of goods within and across countries, and so on. Second point, investing human capital. Education offers the best insurance against the risk of automation. Because the low-paid and uneducated workers are that perform the simpler, more routine tasks. They are the ones at the highest risk of being eventually replaced by machines. So investing in the human capital of the workforce should be a priority for policymakers. I'm sorry. I have alluded to the fact that in recent decades, countries in the region have made substantial progress in improving access to secondary education. But the quality of education continues to lag behind that of advanced nations and developing countries in East Asia that are comparable. There has been an increasing understanding of how investment in early childhood education generates the highest return on investment. This was the subject of a World Bank quite important report in 2019, a World Development Report. But there is room to improve in every dimension of the educational system. uh, as new automation technologies are adopted in Latin American and Caribbean countries, the adult learning and retraining programs will be of the essence, because the transformation in the workplace will happen uh, at the mid-career stage for many workers, and they will need to adapt and adjust, particularly by changing the set of tasks performed at work. And of course, rethinking labor regulations and social protection policies. If you look at the existing policies, in the region, the architecture was geared at wage earners working in the formal sector. And that's a problem because not by chance, those things protect and support the workers in the formal sector, but make it more very expensive and a difficulty for those in the informal sector to move there. So it creates a dichotomy between those happy to be in the formal sector against those out, unhappy because they are out of the formal sector. And much of the regulation in the region focused on the employer-employee relationship, with the social protection programs based on jobs, based on formal jobs. And this architecture led to rigidity and exclusion in an environment where many workers have been self-employed or operated at the margins of formality. Premature deindustrialization, the increasing servicification of the economy, and the growing reliance on electronic platforms raise doubts that wage employment will increase substantially in the coming years. And so we cannot move, the region has to move towards a more flexible regulation of the emerging forms of work in a way that encourages employment and supports formalization, thereby expanding the coverage of social protection to larger segments of the population. Finally, that goes for the institution side of the title of our session, which is, this is maybe the most economics heavy text included in the syllabus, right? But I found the results extremely important in the context of our discussion, and that's why I hope let me highlight here quite why I want you guys to at least to, even if not dealing in detail with the mechanics, but to incorporate the findings of this working paper. So, in the last few decades, there has been little convergence of income levels in Latin America with those in the United States. That's the issue of the middle income trap and the difficulty to converge, which has not been the case, as we saw in the previous session, with emerging Asia and emerging Europe. And what this working paper argues is that this lack of convergence has not been the result of low investments. The rate of investments I showed you in a previous session is low and inefficient, but the lack of convergence is not empirically the result of low investment. In fact, as they conclude, the low investment is the result of a low total factor productivity. Therefore, of the low GDP growth. Is not the cause, is the consequence. This is extremely important. What the paper shows, calls attention to, is that lower human capital levels and lower TFP are the main explanatory factors for the lack of convergence, not because of not the low capital output ratio. So the cross-country difference of TFP, of total factor productivity, are associated with difference in human capital, governance, and business climate indicators. Remember the story of institutions and efficiency, we will have the opportunity to discuss those. Once levels of human capital and governance are taken into account, there is strong conditional cross-country convergence. And this is the takeaway that I intended to obtain exactly with this. Okay. Full of challenges, but we should not pursue the wrong targets, not old style policies of incentivizing and protecting specific sectors, particularly like manufacturing, industry, and so on. We better focus on the horizontal, on the overall, on the productivity factors behind each one of those sectors, and they have to do with institutions, with the business environment. They have to do with the horizontal factors that I mentioned as underlying the ability of the manufacturing sector to go out and or in. Okay, this is the message that I like to highlight. Thank you. See you.